Chapter 64. Esther's Narrative. Soon after I had that conversation with my guardian, he put a sealed paper in my hand one morning and said, "This is for next month, my dear. I found in it £200. I now began very quietly to make such preparations as I thought were necessary, regulating my purchases by my guardian's taste, which I knew very well, of course. I arranged my wardrobe to please him, and hoped I should be highly successful. I did it all so quietly because I was not quite free from my old apprehension that Ada would be rather sorry because my guardian was so quiet himself. I had no doubt that under all the circumstances we should be married in the most private and simple manner. Perhaps I should only have to say to Ada, "Would you like to come and see me married tomorrow, my pet?" Perhaps our wedding might even be as unpretending as her own, and I might not find it necessary to say anything about it until it was over. I thought that if I were to choose, I would like this best. The only exception I made was Mrs. Woodcourt. I told her that I was going to be married to my guardian, and that we had been engaged for some time. She highly approved. She could never do enough for me, and was remarkably softened now in comparison with what she had been when we first knew her. There was no trouble she would not have taken to have been of use to me, but I need hardly say that I only allowed her to take as little as gratified her kindness without tasking it. Of course this was not a time to neglect my guardian, and of course it was not a time for neglecting my darling. So I had plenty of occupation, which I was glad of. As to Charlie, she was absolutely not to be seen for needlework. To surround herself with great heaps of it, baskets full and tables full, and do a little and spend a great deal of time in staring with her round eyes at what there was to do, and persuade herself that she was going to do it, were Charlie's great dignities and delights. Meanwhile, I must say I could not agree with my guardian on the subject of the will, and had some sanguine hopes of Jarndyce and Jarndyce. Which of us was right will soon appear, but I certainly did encourage expectations. In Richard the discovery gave occasion for a burst of business and agitation that buoyed him up for a little time, but he had lost the elasticity even of hope now, and seemed to me to retain only its feverish anxieties. From something my guardian said one day when we were talking about this, I understood that my marriage would not take place until after the term time we had been told to look forward to, and I thought the more for that. How rejoiced I should be if I could be married when Richard and Ada were a little more prosperous. The term was very near indeed, when my guardian was called out of town and went down into Yorkshire on Mr. Woodcourt's business. He had told me beforehand that his presence there would be necessary. I had just come in one night from my dear girls, and was sitting in the midst of all my new clothes, looking at them and all around me and thinking, when a letter from my guardian was brought to me. It asked me to join him in the country, and mentioned by what stagecoach my place was taken, and at what time in the morning I should have to leave town. It added in a postscript that I would not be many hours from Ada. I expected few things less than a journey of that time, but I was ready for it in half an hour, and set off as appointed early next morning. I travelled all day, wondering all day what I could be wanted for at such a distance. Now I thought it might be for this purpose, and now I thought it might be for that purpose, but I was never near the truth. It was night when I came to my journey's end, and found my guardian waiting for me. This was a great relief, for towards evening I had begun to fear, the more so as this letter was a very short one, that he might be ill. However, there he was, as well as was possible to be. When I saw his genial face again, at its brightest best, I said to myself, he has been doing some other great kindness. Not that it required much penetration to say that, because I knew that his being there at all was an act of kindness. Supper was ready at the hotel, and when we were alone at the table he said, "Full of curiosity, no doubt, little woman, to know why I have brought you here." "Well, guardian," said I, without thinking myself of Fatima or you of Bluebeard, "I am a little curious about it." "To ensure your night's rest, my love," he returned gaily. I won't wait until tomorrow to tell you. I have very much wished to express to Woodcourt somehow my sense of his humanity to poor unfortunate Joe, his inestimable service to my young cousins, and his value to us all. When it was decided that he should settle here, it came into my head that I might ask his acceptance of some unpretending and suitable little place to lay his own head in. I therefore caused such a place to be looked out for, and such a place was found on very easy terms, and I have been touching it up for him and making it habitable. However, when I walked over it the day before yesterday, and it was reported ready, I found that I was not housekeeper enough to know whether things were all as they ought to be. So I sent off for the best little housekeeper that could possibly be got, to come and give me her advice and opinion. And here she is, said my guardian, laughing and crying both together. Because he was so dear, so good, so admirable, I tried to tell him what I thought of him, but I could not articulate a word. Tut, tut, said my guardian, you make so much of it, little woman. Why, how you sob! Dame Durden, how you sob! It is with exquisite pleasure, guardian, with a heart full of thanks. Well, well, said he, I am delighted that you approve. I thought you would. I mean it as a pleasant surprise from the little mistress of Bleak House. I kissed him and dried my eyes. I know now, said I have seen this in your face a long while. No, have you really, my dear? Said he. What a Dame Durden it is to read a face. He was so quaintly cheerful that I could not be long otherwise. I was almost ashamed of having been otherwise at all. When I went to bed I cried. I am bound to confess that I cried, but I hope it was with pleasure. I am not quite sure that it was with pleasure. I repeated every word of the letter twice over. A most beautiful summer morning succeeded, and after breakfast we went out arm in arm to see the house of which I was to give my mighty housekeeping opinion. We entered a flower garden by a gate in a side wall, of which he had the key, and the first thing I saw was that the beds and flowers were all laid out according to the manner of my beds and flowers at home. You see, my dear, observed my guardian, standing still with a delighted face to watch my looks. Knowing there could be no better plan, I borrowed yours. We went on by a pretty little orchard where the cherries were nestling among the green leaves, and the shadows of the apple trees were sporting on the grass. To the house itself, a cottage, quite a rustic cottage of dolls' rooms. Such a lovely place, so tranquil and so beautiful, and such a rich smiling country spread around it, with the water sparkling away into the distance, here all overhung with summer growth, there turning a humming mill at its nearest point, glancing through a meadow by the cheerful town, where cricket players were assembling in bright groups, and a flag was flying from a white tent that rippled in the sweet west wind. And still as we went through the pretty rooms, out at the little rustic veranda doors, and underneath the tiny wooden colonnades garlanded with woodbine, jasmine and honeysuckle, I saw in the papering on the walls, in the colours of the furniture, in the arrangement of all the pretty objects, my little tastes and fancies, my little methods and inventions, which they used to laugh at while they praised them, my odd ways everywhere. I could not say enough in admiration of what was all so beautiful. But one secret doubt rose in my mind when I saw this. I thought, oh, would he be the happier for it? Would it not have been better for his peace that I should not have been brought before him? Because although I was not what he thought me, still he loved me very dearly, and it might remind him mournfully of what he believed he had lost. I did not wish him to forget me. Perhaps he might not have done so without these aids to his memory, but my way was easier than his, and I could have reconciled myself even to that, so that he had been the happier for it. And now, my little woman, said my guardian, whom I had never seen so proud and joyful as in showing me these things and watching my appreciation of them. Now, last of all, the name of this house. What's it called, dear guardian? My child, said he, come and see. He took me to the porch which he had hitherto avoided, and said, pausing before we went out, my dear child, don't you guess the name? No, said I. We went out of the porch, and he showed me written over it, Bleak House. He led me to a seat among the leaves close by, and sitting down beside me and taking my hand in his, he spoke to me thus: "My darling girl, in what there has been between us, I have, I hope, been really solicitous for your happiness. When I wrote you the letter to which you brought the answer," smiling as he referred to it, "I had my own too much in view, but I had yours too. Whether under different circumstances I might ever have renewed the old dream I sometimes dreamed when you were very young, of making you my wife one day, I need not ask myself. I did renew it, and I wrote my letter, and you brought your answer. You are following what I say, my child?" I was cold, and I trembled violently, but not a word he uttered was lost. As I sat fixedly looking at him, and the sun's rays descended, softly shining through the leaves upon his bare head, I felt as if the brightness on him must be like the brightness of the angels. "Hear me, my love, but do not speak. It is for me to speak now. When it was that I began to doubt whether what I had done would really make you happy is no matter. Woodcourt came home, and I soon had no doubt at all. I clasped him round the neck and hung my head upon his breast and wept. "Lie confidently here, my child," said he, pressing me gently to him. "I am your guardian and your father now. Rest confidently here." Soothingly, like the gentle rustling of the leaves, and genially, like the ripening weather, and radiantly and beneficently, like the sunshine, he went on. "Understand me, my dear girl. I had no doubt of your being contented and happy with me, being so dutiful and devoted, but I saw with whom you would be happier. That I penetrated his secret when Dame Durden was blind to it is no wonder, for I knew the good that could never change in her better far than she did. Well, I have long been in Alan Woodcourt's confidence, although he was not, until yesterday, a few hours before you came in here, in mine. But I would not have my Esther's bright example lost. I would not have a jot of my dear girl's virtues unobserved and unhonoured. I would not have her admitted on sufferance into the line of Morgan ap Kerry. No, not for the weight in gold of all the mountains of Wales." He stooped to kiss me on the forehead. I sobbed and wept afresh, for I felt as if I could not bear the painful delight of his praise. "Hush, little woman, don't cry. This is to be a day of joy. I have looked forward to it," he said exultingly, "for months on months. A few words more, Dame Trot, and I have said my say. Determined not to throw away one atom of my Esther's worth, I took Mrs. Woodcourt into a separate confidence. Now, madam," said I clearly perceive, and indeed I know to boot, that your son loves my ward. I am further very sure that my ward loves your son, but will sacrifice her love to a sense of duty and affection, and will sacrifice it so completely, so entirely, so religiously, that you should never suspect it, though you watched her day and night. Then I told her all our story, ours, yours, and mine. "Now, madam," said I, "come you knowing this, and live with us. Come you see my child from hour to hour. Set what you see against her pedigree, which is this and this, for I scorn to mince it, and tell me what is the true legitimacy when you shall have quite made up your mind on that subject." "Why, to honour her old Welsh blood, my dear," cried my guardian with enthusiasm. "I believe the heart it animates beats no less warmly, no less admiringly, no less lovingly towards Dame Durden than my own." He tenderly raised my head, and as I clung to him, kissed me in his old fatherly way again and again. What a light now on the protecting manner I had thought about! "One more last word. When Alan Woodcourt spoke to you, my dear, he spoke with my knowledge and consent, but I gave him no encouragement, not I, for these surprises were my great reward, and I was too miserly to part with a scrap of it. He was to come and tell me all that passed, and he did. I have no more to say, my dearest. Alan Woodcourt stood beside your father when he lay dead, stood beside your mother. This is Bleak House. This day I give this house its little mistress, and before God it is the brightest day in all my life." He rose and raised me with him. We were no longer alone. My husband, I have called him by that name full 7 happy years now, stood at my side. Alan, said my guardian, take from me a willing gift, the best wife that ever a man had. What more can I say for you than I know that you deserve her? Take with her the little home that she brings you. You know what she will make it, Alan. You know she has already made its namesake. Let me share its felicity sometimes. And what do I sacrifice? Nothing, nothing. He kissed me once again, and now the tears were in his eyes as he said more softly, Esther, my dearest, after so many years, there is a kind of parting in this too. I know that my mistake has caused you some distress. Forgive your old guardian in restoring him to his old place in your affections, and blot it out of your memory. Alan, take my dear. He moved away from under the green roof of leaves, and stopping in the sunlight outside and turning cheerfully towards us, said, I shall be found about here somewhere. It's a west wind, little woman, due west. Let no one thank me any more, for I am going to revert to my bachelor habits, and if anybody disregards this warning, I'll run away and I'll never come back. What happiness was ours that day! What joy, what rest, what hope, what gratitude, what bliss! We were to be married before the month was out, but when we were to come to take possession of our own house was to depend on Richard and Ada. We all three went home together the next day. As soon as we arrived in town, Alan went straight to see Richard and to carry our joyful news to him and my darling. Late as it was, I meant to go to her for a few minutes before lying down to sleep, but I went home with my guardian first to make his tea for him, and to occupy the old chair by his side, for I did not like to think of its being empty so soon. When we came home, we found that a young man had called 3 times in the course of that one day to see me. Having been told on the occasion of his third call that I was not expected to return before 10 o'clock at night, he had left word that he would call about then. He had left his card 3 times. Mr. Guppy. As I naturally speculated on the objects of these visits, and I always associated something ludicrous with the visitor, it fell out that in laughing about Mr. Guppy I told my guardian of his old proposal and his subsequent retraction. After that, said my guardian, we will certainly receive this hero. So instructions were given that Mr. Guppy should be shown in when he came again, and they were scarcely given when he did come again. He was embarrassed when he found my guardian with me, but recovered himself and said, How do you do, sir? How do you do, sir? Returned my guardian. Thank you, sir, I'm tolerable, returned Mr. Guppy. Will you allow me to introduce my mother, Mrs. Guppy of the Old Street Road, and my particular friend, Mr. Weevil? That is to say, my friend has gone by the name of Weevil, but his name is really, truly Jobling. My guardian begged them to be seated, and they all sat down. Tony, said Mr. Guppy to his friend, after an awkward silence, will you open the case? Do it yourself, returned the friend rather tartly. Well, Mr. Jarndyce, sir, Mr. Guppy, after a moment's consideration, began to the greater diversion of his mother, which she displayed by nudging Mr. Jobling with her elbow and winking at me in a most remarkable manner. I had an idea that I should see Miss Summerson by herself, was not quite prepared for your esteemed presence. But Miss Summerson has mentioned to you, perhaps, that something has passed between us on former occasions. Miss Summerson, returned my guardian, smiling, has made a communication to that effect to me. That, said Mr. Guppy, makes matters easier, sir. I've come out of my articles at Kenge and Carboy's, and I believe with satisfaction all parties are now admitted, after undergoing an examination that's enough to badger a man blue, touching a pack of nonsense that he don't want to know, on the roll of attorneys, and have taken out my certificate, if it would be any satisfaction to you to see it. Thank you, Mr. Guppy, returned my guardian. I am quite willing, I believe, to use a legal phrase, to admit the certificate. Mr. Guppy therefore desisted from taking something out of his pocket, and proceeded without it. I have no capital myself, but my mother has a little property which takes the form of an annuity. Here Mr. Guppy's mother rolled her head as if she never could sufficiently enjoy the observation, and put her handkerchief to her mouth, and again winked at me. And a few pounds for expenses out of pocket in conducting business will never be wanting, free of interest, which is an advantage, you know, said Mr. Guppy feelingly. It's certainly an advantage, returned my guardian. I have some connection, pursued Mr. Guppy, and it lays in the direction of Walcot Square, Lambeth. I have therefore taken a house in that locality, which, in the opinion of my friends, is a hollow bargain. Tax is ridiculous, use of fixtures included in the rent, and intend setting up professionally for myself there forthwith." Here Mr. Guppy's mother fell into an extraordinary passion of rolling her head and smiling waggishly at anybody who would look at her. "It's a 6-roomer, exclusive of kitchens," said Mr. Guppy, "and in the opinion of my friends, a commodious tenement. When I mention my friends, I refer principally to my friend Joblin, who I believe has known me," Mr. Guppy looked at him with a sentimental air, "from boyhood's hour." Mr. Joblin confirmed this with a sliding movement of his legs. "My friend Joblin will render me his assistance in the capacity of clerk, and will live at the house," said Mr. Guppy. "My mother will likewise live in the house when her present quarter in the Old Street Road shall have ceased and expired. Consequently, there will be no want of society. My friend Jobling is naturally aristocratic by taste, and besides being acquainted with the movements of the upper circles, fully backs me in the intentions I am now developing." Mr. Jobling said, "Certainly," and withdrew a little from the elbow of Mr. Guppy's mother. "Now, I have no occasion to mention to you, sir, of being in the confidence of Miss Summerson," said Mr. Guppy. "Mother, I wish you'd be so good as to keep still. That Miss Summerson's image was formerly imprinted on my heart, and I made her a proposal of marriage." "That I have heard," returned my guardian. "Circumstances," pursued Mr. Guppy, "over which I had no control, but quite the contrary, weakened the impression of that image for a time, at which time Miss Summerson's conduct was highly genteel, I may even add magnanimous." My guardian patted me on the shoulder and seemed much amused. "Now, sir," said Mr. Guppy, "I've got it into that state of mind myself that I wish for a reciprocity of magnanimous behaviour. I wish to prove to Miss Summerson that I can rise to the height of which perhaps she hardly thought me capable. I find that the image which I did suppose has been eradicated from my heart is not eradicated. Its influence over me is still tremendous, and yielding to it, I am willing to overlook the circumstances over which none of us have had any control, and renew these proposals to Miss Summerson, which I had the honour to make at a former period. I beg to lay the house in Walcot Square, the business, and myself before Miss Summerson for her acceptance." "Very magnanimous indeed, sir," observed my guardian. "Well, sir," replied Mr. Guppy with candour, "my wish is to be magnanimous. I do not consider that in making this offer to Miss Summerson I am by any means throwing myself away. Neither is that the opinion of my friends. Still, there are circumstances which I submit may be taken into account as set off against any little drawbacks of mine, and so a fair and equitable balance arrived at." "I take it upon myself, sir," said my guardian, laughing as he rang the bell, "to reply to your proposals on behalf of Miss Summerson. She is very sensible of your handsome intentions, and wishes you a good evening, and wishes you well." "Oh," said Mr. Guppy with a blank look, "is that tantamount, sir, to acceptance, or rejection, or consideration?" "To decided rejection, if you please," returned my guardian. Mr. Guppy looked incredulously at his friend and at his mother, who suddenly turned very angry, and at the floor and the ceiling. "Indeed," said he. "Then, Jobling, if you was the friend you represent yourself, I should think you might hand my mother out the gangway instead of allowing her to remain where she ain't wanted." But Mrs. Guppy positively refused to come out of the gangway. She wouldn't hear of it. "Why, get along with you," she said to my guardian. "What do you mean? Ain't my son good enough for you? You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Get out with you." "My good lady," returned my guardian, "it's hardly reasonable to ask me to get out of my own room." "I don't care for that," said Mrs. Guppy. "Get out with you. If we ain't good enough for you, go and procure somebody that is good enough. Go along and find them." I was quite unprepared for the rapid manner in which Mrs. Guppy's power of jocularity merged into a power of taking the profoundest offence. "Go along and find somebody that's good enough for you," repeated Mrs. Guppy. "Get out." Nothing seemed to astonish Mr. Guppy's mother so much, and make her so very indignant, as our not getting out. "Why don't you get out?" said Mrs. Guppy. "What are you stopping here for?" "Mother," interposed her son, always getting before her and pushing her back with one shoulder as she sidled at my guardian, "will you hold your tongue?" "No, William," she returned, "I won't. Not unless he gets out, I won't." However, Mr. Guppy and Mr. Jobling together closed on Mr. Guppy's mother, who began to be quite abusive, and took her, very much against her will, downstairs. her voice rising a stair higher every time her figure got a stair lower, and insisting that we should immediately go and find someone who was good enough for us, and above all things that we should get out. Chapter 65. Beginning the World. The term had commenced, and my guardian found an intimation from Mr. Kenge that the cause would come on in 2 days. As I had sufficient hopes of the will to be in a flutter about it, Alan and I agreed to go down to the court that morning. Richard was extremely agitated, and was so weak and low, though his illness was still of the mind, that my dear girl indeed had sore occasion to be supported. But she looked forward a very little way now to the help that was to come to her, and never drooped. It was at Westminster that the cause was to come on. It had come on there, I dare say, 100 times before, but I could not divest myself an idea that it might lead to some result now. We left home directly after breakfast to be at Westminster Hall in good time, and walked down there through the lively streets, so happily and strangely it seemed, together. As we were going along, planning what we should do for Richard and Ada, I heard somebody calling, "Esther, my dear Esther, Esther!" And there was Caddy Jellyby, with her head out of the window of a little carriage which she hired now to go about to her pupils, she had so many, as if she wanted to embrace me at 100 yards distance. I had written her a note to tell her of all that my guardian had done, but had not had a moment to go and see her. Of course we turned back. The affectionate girl was in that state of rapture, and was so overjoyed to talk about the night when she brought me the flowers, and was so determined to squeeze my face, bonnet and all, between her hands, and go on in wild manner altogether, calling me all kinds of precious names, and telling Alan I had done I don't know what for her, but I was just obliged to get into the little carriage and calm her down by letting her say and do exactly what she liked. Alan, standing at the window, was as pleased as Caddy, and I was as pleased as either of them, and I wonder that I got away as I did, rather than I came off laughing and red, anything but tidy, and looking after Caddy, who looked after us out of the coach window as long as she could see us. This made us some quarter of an hour late, and when we came to Westminster Hall we found that the day's business was begun. Worse than that, we found such an unusual crowd in the Court of Chancery that it was full to the door. We could neither see nor hear what was passing within. It appeared to be something droll, for occasionally there was a laugh and a cry of silence. It appeared to be something interesting, for every one was pushing and striving to get nearer. It appeared to be something that made the professional gentlemen very merry, for there were several young councillors in wigs and whiskers on the outside of the crowd, and when one of them told the others about it, they put their hands in their pockets and quite doubled themselves up with laughter, and went stamping about the pavement of the hall. We asked a gentleman by us if he knew what cause was on. He told us Jarndyce and Jarndyce. We asked him if he knew what was doing in it. He said really no, he did not. Nobody ever did. But as well as he could make out, it was over. Over for the day, we asked him. No, he said, over for good. Over for good. When we heard this unaccountable answer, we looked at one another quite lost in amazement. Could it be possible that the will had set things right at last, and that Richard and Ada were going to be rich? It seemed too good to be true. Alas, it was. Our suspense was short, for a break-up soon took place in the crowd, and the people came streaming out looking flushed and hot, and bringing a quantity of bad air with them. Still, they were all exceedingly amused, and were more like people coming out from a farce or a juggler than from a court of justice. We stood aside, watching for any countenance we knew, and presently great bundles of paper began to be carried out, bundles in bags, bundles too large to be got into any bags, immense masses of papers of all shapes and no shapes, which the bearers staggered under, and threw down for the time being anyhow on the hall pavement, while they went back to bring out more. Even these clerks were laughing. We glanced at the papers, and seeing Jarndyce and Jarndyce everywhere, asked an official-looking person who was standing in the midst of them whether the cause was over. Yes, he said, it was all up with it at last, and burst out laughing too. At this juncture we perceived Mr. Kenge coming out of court with affable dignity upon him, listening to Mr. Vholes, who was deferential and carried his own bag. Mr. Vholes was the first to see us. "Here is Miss Summerson, sir," he said, "and Mr. Woodcourt." "Oh, indeed, yes, truly," said Mr. Kenge, raising his hat to me with polished politeness. "How do you do? Glad to see you. Mr. Jarndyce is not here?" "No, he never came there," I reminded him. "Really," returned Mr. Kenge, "it is as well that he is not here to-day, for his, shall I say, in my good friend's absence, his indomitable singularity of opinion might have been strengthened, perhaps not reasonably, but might have been strengthened." "Pray, what has been done to-day?" asked Allen. "I beg your pardon," said Mr. Kenge, with excessive urbanity. "What has been done to-day?" "What has been done?" repeated Mr. Kenge. "Quite so, yes. Why, not so much has been done. Not much. We have been checked, brought up suddenly, I would say, upon the, shall I term it, threshold." "Is this will considered a genuine document, sir?" said Allen. "Will you tell us that?" "Most certainly, if I could," said Mr. Kenge. "But we have not gone into that. We have not gone into that." "We have not gone into that," repeated Mr. Vholes, as if his low inward voice were an echo. "You are to reflect, Mr. Woodcourt," observed Mr. Kenge, using his silver trowel persuasively and smoothingly, "that this has been a great cause, that it has been a protracted cause, that this has been a complex cause. Jarndyce and Jarndyce has been termed, not inaptly, a monument of chancery practice. Patience has set upon it a long time," said Allen. "Very well, indeed, sir," returned Mr. Kenge, with a certain condescending laugh he had. "Very well, you are further to reflect, Mr. Woodcourt," becoming dignified almost to severity, "that on the numerous difficulties, contingencies, masterly fictions, and forms of procedure in this great cause, there has been expended study, ability, eloquence, knowledge, intellect, Mr. Woodcourt, high intellect. For many years I would say the flower of the bar, and I would presume to add the matured autumnal fruits of the woolsack, have been lavished upon Jarndyce and Jarndyce. If the public have the benefit, and if the country have the adornment of this great grasp, it must be paid for in money or in money's worth, sir." "Mr. Kenge," said Allen, appearing enlightened all in a moment, "excuse me, our time presses. Do I understand that the whole estate is found to have been absorbed in costs?" "I believe so," returned Mr. Kenge. "Mr. Vholes, what do you say?" "I believe so," said Mr. Vholes. "And thus the suit lapses and melts away?" "Probably," returned Mr. Kenge. "Mr. Vholes?" "Probably," said Mr. Vholes. "My dearest life," whispered Allen, "this will break Richard's heart." There was such a shock of apprehension on his face, and he knew Richard so perfectly, and I too had seen much of his gradual decay, that what my dear girl had said to me in the fullness of her foreboding love sounded like a knell in my ears. "In case you should be wanting Mr. C, sir," said Mr. Vholes, coming after us, "you'll find him in court. I left him there resting himself a little. Good day, sir. Good day, Miss Summerson." And he gave me that slowly devouring look of his, while twisting up the strings of his bag before he hastened with it after Mr. Kenge, the benignant shadow of whose conversational presence he seemed afraid to leave. He gave one gasp, as if he had swallowed the last morsel of his client, and his black-buttoned, unwholesome figure glided away to the low door at the end of the hall. "My dear love," said Allen, "leave to me for a little while the charge you gave me. Go home with this intelligence, and come to Ada's by and by." I would not let him take me to a coach, but entreated him to go to Richard without a moment's delay, and leave me to do as he wished. Hurrying home, I found my guardian, and told him gradually with what news I had returned. "Little woman," said he, quite unmoved for himself, "to have done with the suit on any terms is a greater blessing than I had looked for. But my poor young cousins!" We talked about them all the morning, and discussed what it was possible to do. In the afternoon my guardian walked with me to Symonds' Inn, and left me at the door. I went upstairs. When my darling heard my footsteps, she came out into the small passage and threw her arms round my neck. But she composed herself directly, and said that Richard had asked for me several times. Allen had found him sitting in a corner of the court, she told me, like a stone figure. On being roused, he had broken away, and made as if he would have spoken a fierce voice to the judge. He was stopped by his mouth being full of blood, and Allen brought him home. He was lying on a sofa with his eyes closed when I went in. There were restoratives on the table. The room was made as airy as possible, and was darkened. It was very orderly and quiet, Alan stood behind him, watching him gravely. His face appeared to me to be quite destitute of colour, and now that I saw him without his seeing me, I fully saw for the first time how worn away he was. But he looked handsomer than I had seen him look for many a day. I sat down by his side in silence. Opening his eyes by and by, he said in a weak voice, but with his old smile, "Dame Durden, kiss me, my dear." It was a great comfort and surprise to me to find him in his low state cheerful and looking forward. He was happier, he said, in our intended marriage than he could find words to tell me. My husband had been a guardian angel to him and Ada, and he blessed us both, and wished us all the joy that life could yield us. I almost felt as if my own heart would have broken when I saw him take my husband's hand and hold it to his breast. We spoke of the future as much as possible, and said several times that he must be present at our marriage if he could stand upon his feet. Ada would contrive to take him somehow, he said. Yes, surely, dearest Richard, but as my darling answered him thus hopefully, so serene and beautiful, with the help that was come to us so near, I knew. It was not good for him to talk too much, and when he was silent we were silent too. Sitting beside him, I made the pretence of working for my dear, as he had always been used to joke about my being busy, and Ada leaned upon his pillow, holding his head upon her arm. He dozed often, and whenever he woke without seeing him, said first of all, "Where is Woodcourt?" Evening had come on when I lifted my eyes and saw my guardian standing in the little hall. "Who is that, Dame Durden?" Richard asked me. The door was behind him, but he had observed in my face that someone was there. I looked to Alan for advice, and as he nodded yes, bent over Richard and told him. My guardian saw what passed, came softly by me in a moment, and laid his hands on Richard. "Oh, sir," said Richard, "you are a good man, you are a good man," and burst into tears for the first time. My guardian, the picture of a good man, sat down in my place, keeping his hand on Richard's. "My dear Rick," he said, "the clouds have cleared away, and it's bright now. We can see now. We were all bewildered, Rick, more or less. What matters? And how are you, my dear boy?" "I am very weak, sir, but I hope I shall be stronger. I have to begin the world." "Ay, truly, well said," cried my guardian. "I will not begin it in the old way now," said Richard with a sad smile. "I have learned a lesson now, sir. It was a hard one, but you should be assured indeed that I have learned it." "Well, well," said my guardian, comforting him. "Well, well, well, dear boy." "I was thinking, sir," resumed Richard, "that there is nothing on earth I should so much like to see as their house, Dame Durden's and Woodcourt's house. If I could be removed there when I begin to recover my strength, I feel as if I should get well there sooner than anywhere." "Why, so have I been thinking too, Rick," said my guardian, "and our little woman likewise. She and I have been talking of it this very day. I dare say her husband won't object. What do you think?" Richard smiled and lifted up his arm to touch him as he stood behind the head of the couch. "I say nothing of Ada," said Richard, "but I think of her, and have thought of her very much. Look at her. See her here, sir, bending over this pillow when she has so much need to rest upon it herself. My dear love, my poor girl." He clasped her in his arms, and none of us spoke. He gradually released her, and she looked upon us, and looked up to heaven, and moved her lips. "When I get down to Bleak House," said Richard, "I shall have much to tell you, sir, and you will have much to show me. You will go, won't you?" "Undoubtedly, dear Rick." "Thank you. Like you. But it's all like you. They've been telling me how you planned it, and how you remembered all Esther's familiar tastes and ways. It will be like coming to the old Bleak House again." "And you will come there too, I hope, Rick. I am a solitary man now, you know, and it will be a charity to come to me. A charity to come to me, my love," he repeated to Ada, as he gently passed his hand over her golden hair and put a lock of it to his lips. I think he vowed within himself to cherish her if she were left alone. "It was a troubled dream," said Richard, clasping both my guardian's hands eagerly. "Nothing more, Rick, nothing more. And you, being a good man, can pass it as such, and forgive and pity the dreamer, and be lenient and encouraging when he wakes." "Indeed I can. What am I but another dreamer, Rick?" "I will begin the world," said Richard, with light in his eyes. My husband drew a little nearer towards Ada, and I saw him solemnly lift up his hand to warn my guardian. "When shall I go from this place to that pleasant country where the old times are? where I shall have strength to tell what Ada has been to me, where I shall be able to recall my many faults and blindnesses, where I shall prepare myself to be a guide to my unborn child," said Richard. "Where shall I go?" "Dear Rick, when you are strong enough," returned my guardian. "Ada, my darling." He sought to raise himself a little. Ellen raised him so that she could hold him on her bosom, which was what he wanted. "I have done you many wrongs, my own. I have fallen like a poor stray shadow on your way. I have married you to poverty and trouble. I have scattered your means to the winds. You will forgive me in all this, my Ada, before I begin the world." A smile irradiated his face as she bent to kiss him. He slowly laid his face down upon her bosom, drew his arms closer round her neck, and with one parting sob began the world. Not this world. Oh, not this. The world that sets it right. When all was still, at a late hour, poor crazed Miss Flite came weeping to me and told me that she had given her birds their liberty. Chapter 66. Down in Lincolnshire. There is a hush upon Chesney Wold in these altered days, as there is upon a portion of the family history. The story goes that Sir Leicester paid some who would have spoken out to hold their peace, but it's a lame story, feebly whispering and creeping about, and any brighter spark of life it shows soon dies away. It is known for certain that the handsome Lady Dedlock lies in the mausoleum in the park, where the trees arch darkly overhead, and the owl is heard at night making the woods ring. But when she was brought home to be laid among the echoes of that solitary place, or how she died, is all a mystery. Some of her old friends, principally to be found among the peachy-cheeked charmers with skeleton throats, did once occasionally say, as they toyed in a ghastly manner with large fans, like charmers reduced to flirting with grim death, after losing all their other beaux, did at once occasionally say, when the world assembled together, that they wondered whether the ashes of the Dedlocks, entombed in the mausoleum, never rose against the profanation of her company. But the dead and gone Dedlocks take it very calmly, and have never been known to object. Up from among the fern in the hollow, and winding by the bridle road among the trees, comes sometimes this lonely spot the sound of horses' hoofs. Then may be seen Sir Leicester, invalided, bent, and almost blind, but a worthy presence yet, riding with a stalwart man beside him, constant to his bridle rein. When they come to a certain spot before the mausoleum door, Sir Leicester's accustomed horse stops of his own accord, and Sir Leicester, pulling off his hat, is still for a few moments before they ride away. War rages yet with the audacious Boythorn, though at uncertain intervals, and now hotly and now coolly, flickering like an unsteady fire. The truth is said to be that when Sir Leicester came down to Lincolnshire for good, Mr. Boythorn showed a manifest desire to abandon his right of way, and to do whatever Sir Leicester would, which Sir Leicester, conceiving to be a condescension to his illness or misfortune, took in such high dudgeon that it was so magnificently aggrieved by, that Mr. Boythorn found himself under the necessity of committing a flagrant trespass to restore his neighbour to himself. Similarly, Mr. Boythorn continues to post tremendous placards on the disputed thoroughfare, with his bird upon his head, to hold forth vehemently against Sir Leicester in the sanctuary of his own home. Similarly, he also defies him as of old in the little church, by testifying a bland unconsciousness of his existence. But it is whispered that when he is most ferocious towards his old foe, he is really most considerate, and that Sir Leicester, in the dignity of being implacable, little supposes how much he is humoured. As little does he think how near together he and his antagonist have suffered in the fortunes of two sisters, and his antagonist, who knows it now, is not the man to tell him, so the quarrel goes on to the satisfaction of both. In one of the lodges of the park, that lodge within sight of the house where once upon a time, when the waters were out down in Lincolnshire, my lady used to see the keeper's child, the stalwart man, the trooper formerly, is housed. Some relics of his old calling hang upon the walls, and these is the chosen recreation of a little lame man about the stable yard, to keep gleaming bright. A busy little man he always is, in the polishing at harness, house doors, of stirrup irons, bits, curb chains, harness bosses, anything in the way of a stable yard that will take a polish, leading a life of friction. A shaggy little damaged man withal, but not unlike an old dog of some mongrel breed who has been considerably knocked about. He answers to the name of Phil. A goodly sight it is to see the grand old housekeeper, harder of hearing now, going into the church on the arm of her son, and to observe, which few do, for this house is scant of company in these times, the relations of both towards Sir Leicester, and his towards them. They have visitors in the high summer weather, when a grey cloak and umbrella, unknown to Chelsea Wold at any other periods, are seen among the leaves, when two young ladies are occasionally found gambling in the sequestered saw pits at such nooks of the park, and when the smoke of two pipes wreathes away into the fragrant evening air from the trooper's door. There is a fife heard trolling within the lodge on the inspiring topic of the British Grenadiers, and as the evening closes in, a gruff, inflexible voice is heard to say, while two men pace together up and down, "But I never own it before the old girl. Discipline must be maintained." The greater part of the house is shut up, and it's a show house no longer. Yet Sir Leicester holds his shrunken state in the long drawing room for all that, and reposes in his old place before my lady's picture, closed in by night with broad screens, illumined only in that part. The light of the drawing room seems gradually contracting and dwindling until it shall be no more. A little more, in truth, and it will be all extinguished for Sir Leicester, and the damp door in the mausoleum, which shuts so tight and looks so obdurate, will have opened and received him. Volumnia, growing with the flight of time pinker as to the red in her face, and yellower as to the white, reads to Sir Leicester in the long evenings, and is driven to various artifices to conceal her yawns, of which the chief and most efficacious is the insertion of the pearl necklace between her rosy lips, long-winded treatises on the Buffy and Boodle question, showing how Buffy is immaculate and Boodle villainous, and how the country is lost by being all Boodle and no Buffy, or saved by being all Buffy and no Boodle, must be one of the two, and cannot be anything else, are the staple of her reading. Sir Leicester is not particular what it is, and does not appear to follow it very closely. Further than that, he always comes broad awake the moment Volumnia ventures to leave off, and sonorously repeating her last words, begs with some displeasure to know if she finds herself fatigued. However, Volumnia, in the course of a bird-like hopping about and pecking at papers, has alighted on a memorandum concerning herself in the event of anything happening to her kinsman, which is handsome compensation for an extensive course of reading, and holds even the dragon boredom at bay. The cousins generally are rather shy of Chesney Wold in its dullness, but take to it a little in the shooting season, when the guns are heard in the plantations, and a few scattered beaters and keepers wait at the old places of appointment for low-spirited twos and threes of cousins. The debilitated cousin, more debilitated by the dreariness of the place, gets into a fearful state of depression, groaning under penitential sofa pillars in his gunless hours. Infernal old jails, enough to souffle up for ever. The only great occasions for Volumnia in this changed aspect of the place in Lincolnshire are those occasions, rare and widely separated, when something is to be done for the county or the country in the way of gracing a public ball. Then indeed does the tuckered sylph come out in fairy form, and proceed with joy under cousinly escort to the exhausted old assembly room, 14 heavy miles off, which, during 364 days and nights of every ordinary year, is a kind of antipodean lumber room, full of old chairs and tables upside down. Then indeed does she captivate all hearts by her condescension, by her girlish vivacity, and by her skipping about as in the days when the hideous old general, with a mouth too full of teeth, had not cut one of them at 2 guineas each. Then does she twirl and twine, a pastoral nymph of good family, through the mazes of the dance. Then do the swains appear with tea, with lemonade, with sandwiches, with homage. Then she is kind and cruel, stately and unassuming, various, beautifully wilful. Then there is a singular kind of parallel between her and the little glass chandeliers of another age, embellishing that assembly room, which, with their meagre stems, their spare little drops, their disappointing knobs where no drops are, their bare little stalks in which knobs and drops have both departed, and their little feeble prismatic twinkling, all seem Volumnias. For the rest, Lincolnshire life to Volumnia is a vast blank of overgrown house looking out upon the trees, sighing, wringing their hands, bowing their heads, and casting their tears upon the window panes in monotonous depressions. A labyrinth of grandeur, less the property of an old family of human beings in their ghostly likenesses than of an old family of echoings and thunderings which start out of their 100 graves at every sound and go resounding through the building. A waste of unused passages and staircases, into which a drop of comb upon a bedroom floor at night is to send a stealthy footfall on an errand through the house. A place where few people care to go about alone, where a maid screams if an ash drops from the fire, takes to crying at all times and seasons, becomes the victim of a low disorder of the spirits, and gives warning and departs. Thus Chesney Wold, with so much of itself abandoned to darkness and vacancy, with so little change under the summer shining or the wintry lowering, so sombre and motionless always, no flag flying now by day, there no rows of lights sparkling at night, with no family to come and go, no visitors to be the souls of pale cold shapes of rooms, no stir of life about it. Passion and pride, even to the stranger's eyes, have died away from the place in Lincolnshire, and yielded it to dull repose. Chapter 67. The close of Esther's narrative. Full 7 happy years I have been the mistress of Bleak House. The few words that I have to add to what I have written are soon penned. Then I and the unknown friend to whom I write will part forever. Not without much dear remembrance on my side, not without some, I hope, on his or hers. They gave my darling into my arms, and through many weeks I never left her. The little child who was to have done so much was born before the turf was planted on its father's grave. It was a boy, and I and my husband and my guardian gave him his father's name. The help that my dear counted on did come to her, though it came in the eternal wisdom for another purpose. Though to bless and restore his mother, not his father, was the errand of this baby, its power was mighty to do it. When I saw the strength of the weak little hand, and how its touch could heal my darling's heart and raise hope within her, I felt a new sense of the goodness and tenderness of God. They throve, and by degrees I saw my dear girl pass into my country garden and walk there with her infant in her arms. I was married then. I was the happiest of the happy. It was at this time that my guardian joined us and asked Ada when she would come home. "Both houses are your home, my dear," said he, "but the older Bleak House claims priority. When you and my boy are strong enough to do it, come and take possession of your home." Ada called him her dearest cousin John, but he said no, it must be guardian now. He was her guardian henceforth, and the boys, and he had an old association with the name. So she called him guardian, and has called him guardian ever since. The children know him by no other name. I say the children, I have 2 little daughters. It is difficult to believe that Charlie, round-eyed still, and not at all grammatical, is married to a miller in our neighbourhood. Yet so it is, and even now, looking up from my desk as I write early in the morning at my summer window, I see the mill beginning to go round. I hope the miller will not spoil Charlie, but he is very fond of her, and Charlie is rather vain of such a match, for he is well to do and was in great request. So far as my small maid is concerned, I might suppose time to have stood still for 7 years, still as the mill did half an hour ago, since little Emma, Charlie's sister, is exactly what Charlie used to be. As to Tom, Charlie's brother, I am really afraid to say what he did at school in ciphering, but I think it was decimals. He is apprenticed to the miller, whatever it was, and is a good bashful fellow, always falling in love with somebody and being ashamed of it. Caddy Jellyby passed her very last holidays with us, and was a dearer creature than ever, perpetually dancing in and out of the house with the children as if she had never given a dancing lesson in her life. Caddy keeps her own little carriage now instead of hiring one, and lives a full 2 miles further westward than Newman Street. She works very hard, her husband, an excellent one, being lame and being able to do very little. Still, she is more than contented, and does all she has to do with all her heart. Mr. Jellyby spends his evenings at her new house with his head against the wall, as he used to do in her old one. I have heard that Mrs. Jellyby was understood to suffer great mortification from her daughter's ignoble marriage and pursuits, but I hope she got over it in time. She has been disappointed in Borrioboola, which turned out a failure in consequence of the King of Borrioboola wanting to sell everybody who survived the climate for rum. But she had taken up with the rights of women to sit in Parliament, and Caddy tells me it is a mission involving more correspondence than the old one. I had almost forgotten Caddy's poor little girl. She is not such a mite now, but she is deaf and dumb. I believe there never was a better mother than Caddy, who learns at her scanty intervals of leisure innumerable deaf and dumb arts to soften the affliction of her child. As if I were never to have done with Caddy, I am reminded of Peepy and old Mr. Turveydrop. Peepy is in the Custom House and doing extremely well. Old Mr. Turveydrop, very apoplectic, still exhibits his deportment about town, still enjoys himself in the old manner, is still believed in the old way. He is constant in his patronage of Peepy, and is understood to have bequeathed him a favourite French clock in his dressing-room, which is not his property. With the first money we saved at home, we added to our pretty house by throwing out a little growlery expressly for my guardian, which we inaugurated with great splendour the next time he came down to see us. I try to write all this lightly, because my heart is full in drawing to an end. But when I write of him, my tears will have their way. I never look at him, but I hear our poor dear Richard calling him a good man. To Ada and her pretty boy he is the fondest father. To me he is what he has ever been. And what name can I give that? He is my husband's best and dearest friend. He is our children's darling. He is the object of our deepest love and veneration. Yet while I feel towards him as if he were a superior being, I am so familiar with him and so easy with him that I almost wonder at myself, have I never lost my old names? Yet while I feel towards him as if he were a superior being, I am so familiar with him and so easy with him that I almost wonder at myself. I have never lost my old names, nor has he lost his, nor do I ever, when he is with us, sit in any other place than in my old chair at his side. Dame Trot, Dame Durden, little woman, all just the same as ever, and I answer, yes, dear guardian, just the same. I have never known the wind to be in the east for a single moment since the day when he took me to the porch to read the name. I remarked to him once that the wind seemed ever in the east now, and he said no, truly it had finally departed from that quarter on that very day. I think my darling girl is more beautiful than ever. The sorrow that has been in her face, for it is not there now, seems to have purified even its innocent expression, and to have given it a diviner quality. Sometimes when I raise my eyes and see her in the black dress that she still wears, teaching my Richard, I feel, it is difficult to express, as if it were good to know that she remembers her dear Esther in her prayers. I call him my Richard, but he says that he has 2 mammas and I am one. We are not rich in the bank, but we have always prospered, and we have quite enough. I never walk out with my husband, but I hear people bless him. I never go into a house of any degree, but I hear his praises or see them in grateful eyes. I never lie down at night, but I know that the course of the day he has alleviated pain and soothed some fellow creature in the time of need. I know that from the beds of those who were past recovery, thanks have often gone up in the last hour for his patient ministration. Is not this to be rich? People even praise me as the doctor's wife. People even like me as I go about, and make so much of me that I'm quite abashed. I owe it all to him, my love, my pride. They like me for his sake, as I do everything I do in life for his sake. A night or two ago, after bustling about preparing for my darling and my guardian and little Richard, who are coming to morrow, I was sitting out in the porch, of all places, that dearly memorable porch, when Alan came home. So he said, "My precious little woman, what are you doing there?" And I said, "The moon is shining so brightly, Alan, and the night is so delicious that I've been sitting here thinking." "Well, what have you been thinking about, my dear?" asked Alan then. "How curious you are," said I. "I'm almost ashamed to tell you, but I've been thinking about my old looks, such as they were." "And what have you been thinking about them, my busy bee?" said Alan. "I have been thinking that I thought it was impossible that you could have loved me any better, even if I had retained them." "Such as they were," said Alan, laughing. "Such as they were, of course." "My dear Dame Durden," said Alan, drawing my arm through his, "do you ever look in the glass? You know I do. You see me do it. Don't you know you are prettier than you ever were?" "I did not know that. I am not certain that I know it now. But I know that my dearest little pets are very pretty, and that my darling is very beautiful, and that my husband is very handsome, and that my guardian has the brightest and most benevolent face that ever was seen. And they can very well do without much beauty in me, even supposing." End of chapter 67. End of Bleak House by Charles Dickens.